Hi. Hi, hello everyone. Well, it's way busier than I thought it was going to be, which is really cool. Yeah, I think animals and architecture is still kind of a niche topic, and so I just thought if we'd fill up the bottom area of this, it would be great. And I think today we completely sold all the seats out, so that's amazing. So yeah, welcome to this Architecture on Stage event put together by the Ecotecture Foundation with the partnership of the Barbican Centre. My name is Eliot Haworth. I'm a writer, editor, researcher with a background in zoology and architectural history. And I have a big fascination with the relationships between non-human life and the built environment, and more broadly, the complex political, social, and philosophical dynamics of how human and non-human life relate to and interact with one another. And this event is part of a wider project looking at animals in the built environment that's going to be released by the Ecotecture Foundation in podcast form later in the year. So if you enjoy what you hear tonight, then keep an eye out for that. We've got a really exciting lineup of speakers this evening. So I'm going to keep my opening remarks pretty brief. Animals have a very deep place within the history of architecture, and we could have done an entire evening or evening upon evening on animals as forms of aesthetic and technological inspiration, or about zoos or pets. However, these talks will focus more on the concept of cities as habitats and spaces where non-human life is a precondition, not an exception, of animals as subjects, not objects, beings that can and should be taken into account in how cities and built space at large is assembled. And throughout the evening, talks will cover scales that span territory, the architectural object, policy, economics, community, and modes of observation. And the evening is not really meant to provide any big solutions. It's a small snapshot of a very big story, and it's a starting point for discussions on an emerging and complex topic. A number of these talks will be about optimism and inspiration, but others will touch upon difficulty or failure or awkwardness. And I believe this is a good thing because non-human lives, considered critically, fundamentally stimulate and challenge us. And to acknowledge non-human life within an architectural context is to inherently engage with realities of climate crisis, biodiversity loss, as well as social and political questions of how our world is constructed and for whom. So before we kick off, I just want to say some quick thank yous to two organizations who contributed field recordings that were playing as we opened and kind of filling up the room nicely. So thank you to Clea and James, who run an organization called DEEP, which is an ecological research group who harness remote sensing and AI analytics to delve into intricate webs of ecosystem interaction. And thank you to Aladdin and Ellen from Apian, which is a collective artistic project focused on the relationships between bee species and humans. They contributed recordings of beehives taken in Morocco, together with the sound artist Lauren Goodell. And there's also an interview with Aladdin and Ellen in the upcoming podcast series on an episode looking at bees and animal metaphors in architecture. And a final quick thank you to Alex Capps, who's the amazing sound designer who stitched and layered everything together really incredibly and who's working with us on the upcoming series. So shout out to Alex. Quick bit of admin. We've got 8 presentations, 9 speakers. Oh no, we might, someone stopped on a train, but he's co-presenting, so 8 or 9 speakers, and lots of ideas. Each speaker will present, and then we'll all assemble on stage at the end for a panel discussion, followed by audience questions. So please use this time to kind of think and prepare anything, because I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. I'm going to go and sit in the dark in the corner over there now, and you'll hear from me occasionally as I introduce people. But before that, please can you join me in welcoming our first speaker for tonight, Roberta Jurčić. So Roberta is a partner, one sec. Roberta is a partner at B+ and joins us from Berlin, where her work focuses on socio-ecological transformation and adaptive reuse of existing buildings with ecologically and economically viable answers in mind. Welcome, Roberta.
Hello, good evening everyone, and thank you Eliot for the invitation. As he said, my name is Roberta, and I would just like to name also the other partners of the studio. They are Arno Brandelhuber, Olaf Gravet, Jonas Janke and Jolene Lee, and we are situated in Berlin. Tonight I will show you the project we are currently working on, and it's called Mäusebunker CC. And to start with and introduce you to the building, I will play shortly the introduction video that we made in the office.
Es war einmal eine Tierversuchsanstalt, gebaut im Südwesten Berlins als Teil der Charité, geplant als Maschine für Forschung und Experimente, gedacht als Zeichen der Überlegenheit über die Natur. Nichts sollte rein, nichts sollte raus. Ein Bunker inmitten der Stadt. Doch die Menschen wussten, was hinter den Mauern passiert. Sie protestierten für die Schließung des Gebäudes und gegen die Vorstellung, was der Mäusebunker war. Zeugnis der Grausamkeiten von Menschen an Tieren, Zeichen für unendliches Wachstum und Fortschritt, Zweifel an der Abgrenzung zwischen Mensch und Natur.
So, quite a big task to answer to this question, to this building, and maybe for the beginning just to show how we started to work on the building. So this project started with multi-species cohabitation as a semester topic in the ETH in Zurich, where Arno holds a chair called Station Plus. It transitioned to both the B+ office, where we are still planning the future of the building, and to the House Europe, a non-profit organization, which I will shortly talk about in the very end of the presentation. At the Station Plus, we use film as a storytelling tool to communicate architecture to the wider audience, and each year we concentrate on the different topics, alternating one semester is a research, and then it's followed by the next semester where we choose one existing building where we implement those findings. And in spring 2020, we explored the multi-species cohabitation within architecture and what are possibilities of the same. By the end of the semester, in the April of 2020, came a petition by a group of architects that wanted to preserve Mäusebunker, the former animal testing lab that was put up for a demolition. It was marked as a post-war German piece of architecture, and a large group of people supported the initiative. And at that time, we thought Mäusebunker couldn't be there a better building than that one to implement those ideas of cohabitation to a building. All the student works exploring these different ways, which were done over the 2 years, you can find on station.plus website. And 2 years afterwards, we received in the office the invitation from Berlinische Galerie to make an exhibition as a part of Suddenly Wonderful, which was about to explore what are the potential futures of the buildings that fell out of the use in Berlin. Amongst others, there was a building of Mäusebunker. The building, while it was served as an animal testing laboratory, it was completely sealed off from the world outside due to the high hygienic requirements, and every second floor was equipped mostly for the air ventilation. This is the black part, and this occupied around 60% of the building, leaving the remaining 40% to the humans and back then the non-voluntary, non-humans inhabitants of the building. As the head of the heritage department in Berlin stated that he will not protect any of the buildings within the city that have no future use, he made this decision because if the building doesn't have a use, the Berlin taxpayers would bear the costs of empty buildings. He said that the future use needs to be found, and as a part of this exhibition, we decided to move on and to show what is possible within the building. Just to shorten it, the building will be partially for the art residencies, because in Berlin there is a very big demand for those programs, and the other part is for the non-humans, and I will tonight more concentrate on that part. The main part was to flip the elements or the prefabricated elements of the facade, and by the opening of those, you would enable air and sunlight to open or to enter the building. And this at the same time expose the hidden structural skeleton of the building, and enabled around 90% to be used by the humans, and the remaining 10% by the non-humans. The main part that would be by the non-humans was supposed to be the basement, but not in this calculation, also the surrounding, which would mean to deseal the surrounding, to reforestate that part, and also to prepare certain facade elements that would foster habitats for different species. These were these slightly complicated flipped elements that would result in different species accommodation. After that, shortly after the exhibition was closed, the building went under that heritage protection, and it was saved from its demolition. Now it's listed, and it's owned by the state of Berlin, so it's no longer owned by the Charité, who was previous owner and wanted to demolish it. So that was a short, or like a small win that we got after the exhibition. Right now, as the part of the office, we are adapting the original proposal to the one that would follow more realistic economic situation. And due to the high costs of the air ducts that we envisioned in the first go, and floor punctures that were supposed to bring more air in, and initially enabled 90% usability, we ended up with a scheme of 45% that could be used by the humans, and the remaining 55% by the non-humans. Unfortunately, the facade elements that were supposed to get more complicated shape, let's say, will be removed and now just replaced with the glazing that are just necessary where the cohabitation will happen. And we reconsider how to ensure the cohabitation stays part of the project regardless of the market, as well as this traditional architect-client relationship, which we try to implement in the first part, that we kind of try to assume what the non-human agents would like to have, and we came to somewhat more predictable solutions. And in a way, we would plan for them in advance, leave it after the completion and renovation, and just see what happens. And this led us to the question how to make cohabitation systemic in a human-centric legal framework. We connected with the different organizations and are trying to find a way of embedding non-humans into the building, ensuring to stay even and under exclamation mark, the non-productive entity within the building, so that the market kind of doesn't push away this cohabitation. We are now formulating a legal framework that grants part of the building to the non-humans, and the idea is somewhat similar to the ex-rota print. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the project, but it's basically a building in Berlin where the ownership and the land, it's kind of detached from each other, and land is leased for a fixed price by the non-profit foundation that removes property from the flow of commerce and in the way protects you from yourself in the future. And by protecting the building, we understood the possibilities of legislation, and that legislation can be an architecting tool. And for instance, through the life cycle assessment of the building, we found out that demolition of the building, which would include how much CO2 was embedded into the building for the lifespan of the building and into its demolition, that this could be seen as the equivalent of cutting a Tiergarten, which is the biggest Berlin park, for a period of 27 years. And this led us to this final part, which is House Europe, a European Citizens Initiative. It seems that it's maybe not part of this discussion, but actually it is. It's all part of the same topic, and it tries to put demolition of structurally good buildings aside and incentivize the renovation. Unfortunately, UK can't participate longer in this initiative, but I hope some of you hold EU passports, or you have friends and family to whom you can share, and hopefully you will spread the word about the initiative. Thank you very much for the attention, and I will leave the stage for the next one. I'm already past my time. I can see beeping.
Thank you, Roberta. So could we please have Filipa up? Hi. So our next speaker is Filipa Ramos. Who's a writer and curator whose research focuses on how contemporary art fosters relationships across humans and other animals. And she's just co-curated both the inaugural Vienna Climate Biennale and the Catalan contribution to this year's Venice Biennale. Thank you, Filipa.
Thank you so much, Eliot, for this wonderful invitation, and thank you so much for joining us, so many. It's incredible to see this room so full, and I would also like to start by thanking all the spiders, insects, fungal entities, mice, and all other organisms who have had a very good taste and have chosen this building as their home, and who are here voluntarily attending this conference with us. So, a little bit of an informal introduction. I'm the daughter of an architect, and so my relationship with architecture has been one of trouble and rebellion. Throughout my youth, I systematically questioned and challenged forms of human spatial dominance and what I perceived somehow as the materialization of anthropocentrism into sort of building exercises. And for too long, I believe, and I still believe now, that most people have ignored the agency of materials, not to mention of other beings, but also of materials, and the needs and rights of previous land occupants, the possibilities of cohabitation with all those non-human beings and organisms who had not been brought willingly into a building, either death in the form of food or clothing or utensils, or alive as pets, decorative props, or forced laborers. No? And we can think of all the names: pests, feral species, plagues, and all other beings that have been classified as undesirable and menacing the stability and tranquility of our dwellings, and also of that of people and their elected non-human occupiers and extensions. So I see them as my possible allies in investigating the urban myths that have been edified throughout the consolidation of modernity. And I would love to spend more time with this, and I've written a lot about this, especially about the relationship between plants and museums, about the architectonic perversities of zoological gardens, and also about how the design of natural history museums have somehow contributed to normalize horror. But here instead, I want to talk about something more pleasant, and I would like to focus on a recent project which does not critique the human spaces, but instead proposes a spatial possibility to host sounds and expressive means of animals, investigating the role that sound plays in shaping and transforming space, in inducing a transformative experience of becoming other and of bringing us closer to the perceptual realms of other beings, making us feel and understand the need to care and also the need to respect the natural world. So Bestiari is a sonic environment that just opened in the Venice Art Biennial that just opened last week. And it's a project developed by an artist from Catalonia called Carlos Casas, who some years ago fell in love with a book which was written in 1417, in the beginning of the 15th century, written by a man called Anselm Turmeda. And in this book, Anselm Turmeda falls asleep in a garden, wakes up with the capacity of understanding the languages of animals, and is surrounded by a parliament of animals who decide to trial him as representative of humanity for the crimes that humanity has constantly done towards animals. And this trial, the book is called The Dispute of the Donkey. The trial is led by a donkey, and it evolves through 19 arguments that touch upon themes such as architecture. The argument is that bees make houses that are much more sophisticated than the ones we make. To spatial orientation, how swallows can fly across the globe and still find their original nests in ways that we could not. To care for the kin, how ants care for their families, and so on. And Carlos Casas decided to bring this book and its narrative to the present, bridging a medieval imaginary with current technological advances, in particular in the field of sonic exploration, and create a sound installation that relies on a system of sonorization called ambisonics, rendering the sounds of 7 animal species, both natural and imagined, from Catalonia. Now, the space is hosting this environment, and sound really modifies a space and makes it become something else. All the sound recordings and the sound editing were made in collaboration with 2 extraordinary British sound people, Chris Watson and Tony Myatt, who have worked throughout the whole process in this space and in transforming an old building for the repair of boats into a place where you can actually hear sounds that you could not, that probably most of you wouldn't even know they existed. Mainly infrasounds that often you don't even hear them with your ears, you feel them in your stomach through vibrations. And so the sounds of snakes, dolphins, donkeys, elephants, bats, parakeets are rendered in a composition that lasts for hours and evolves in correspondence to daylight. And at the same time as it's modulating and transforming space and filling space or emptying it out at times as well, is also inviting us to relate to space differently and to understand what it means to exist with another body and to perceive the world through another sensorial realm, what it means to see through sound, for instance, like bats do, or what it means to only perceive certain tonalities, because it's also accompanied by a moving image work. And it's exactly this proposal that art, when speaking about environment and when speaking about ecology, can not only bombard us with information and make us aware of the terrible circumstances in which we're living, but also make us remember and make us be very aware that in order for us to care, we also need to remember how much we love and how close we can be, or how distant we can be, by also understanding that we know so little about other beings. So basically, bestiary becomes this space for the past and for the future, not only of a human who most hopefully will become less human and will embrace their animal side again, and understanding how ancient literature, modern technology, and their relationship to spatial practices can create a new world. And I have a time here beeping, telling me that it's time to go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Filipa. Sorry about the aggressive timer. So next up, please welcome to the stage Samir Bantal. Samir is director of AMO, the architectural think tank of OMA. With research at its core, AMO's work spans architecture, culture, media, and technology. Thank you, Samir.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Thank you, Eliot. It feels a bit like going to the dentist with you just calling out our names.
I can do it in a less intense way. I think about how to do that.
No, sorry, that's already 10 seconds of my time. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Samir Bantal, director of AMO, as Eliot already mentioned. And I'm going to show my slides. And these are just a selection, a small selection of the kind of countless slide decks that we made in the past couple of years, trying to make sense of what we observed was happening in a place where we as architects are actually not really trained, or maybe not trained, to look at, engage with, which we called the countryside. And even though animals were not the main topic, kind of non-human cases were always present in the background of our research. And I think moving forward, since we are continuing this research to a kind of next iteration, we have to give it a kind of a central role in the next chapter. So when we presented our research on the countryside at the Guggenheim back in 2020 in New York, we presented its history, its kind of main cast of figures, and a kind of current status quo. And every level contained different topics of this rotunda, ranging from ancient concepts of free time in the countryside to the physical manifestation of politics and the market economy. And during our research, it became evident that in order to maintain our modern urban life in one part of the world, we had to surrender another part of the world to a kind of increasing Cartesian rigor as the only effective interface we know outside the city to the unknown and to the untamed nature. And if, in only 100 years, we went from a situation on the left to the situation on the right, we could declare actually that the countryside is much more susceptible to dramatic change and experimentation than any modern city. And of course, our contemporary Cartesian view, let's say, of our non-human associates hasn't changed much since the 17th century, when machines were replacing animals for entertainment and later as a kind of full stand-ins of animals, differentiating from machines as animals and animals as machines. And much like Descartes' view on animals, animals have become machines and part of a complex system. And we've placed, especially cattle, in a kind of twilight zone that is neither city nor nature. And so when in 2017, the UN declared that the number of people living in cities had surpassed the number of people living in the rural parts of the world, the city, which was studied and envisioned in countless kind of publications, manifestos, and conferences, declared it our inevitable fate. While our knowledge, let's say from the architecture point of view, on the rural was almost non-present. And accelerating this kind of urban meant actually thinning out the non-urban, where less people need to manage more land, more nature. And this kind of large-scale infrastructures of food and energy are in a way effectively diminishing diversity and inclusion and perhaps diminishing our chances of survival. And so we can produce enormous quantities of corn, but it's only one type. And so much like the 90% of cattle in industrialized countries that come from just 6 tightly defined breeds, decades of kind of market-driven breeding, especially in Europe and the West, these types have now surpassed basically every other type of cattle in production and push inferior types to extinction. And even though the indigenous breeds would be better at dealing with, for example, heat or cold, they are slowly pushed to extinction. And so, like the language of the countryside that is less embedded in tradition and more kind of tech management infused language, its architecture also becomes uniform. And so whether dirt, insects, animals are replaced by kind of optimized climate conditions that require as little involvement from nature as possible, which we on the right actually call the new organic. And so cattle barns like this one in Qatar require the kind of same uniform to enter as data centers, laboratories, and greenhouses. And the architecture is a kind of sublime form of architecture, a uniform architecture, the same uniform for data, for plants and animals, large, white, anonymous boxes where architects actually have no place. Sublime interiors out of reach for the building codes for humans, but apparently acquire building codes for non-humans. And while some scientists propose that humans should maybe retreat from nature and basically for at least 50% should remain inaccessible for humans to preserve the kind of fragile ecosystems, others suggest a kind of heavily tech-infused countryside that could actually benefit from this kind of alliance of machines and nature, as machines will help us to understand the animal kingdom and maybe give animals finally their agency. And as facial recognition models read emotions in animals based on the angle of ears, mouth, and eyes. Sorry. Potentially even reading animals' minds. And I wonder if we then ever would drink a drop of milk. And we would apply buffer zones on an urban level between wilderness and civilization, where, like this case in Rwanda, the gorillas take breaks from the wilderness on the right and move to the buffer zone, an area not meant for people nor for animals. But in this in this buffer zone, which is close to the farms and the people that the gorillas got used to, there is no nuisance of trees and obstacles, and gorillas can actually lavishly enjoy the food and weather. So basically a countryside where humans have been replaced by machines because machines are more humane. And the University of Wageningen actually is testing out this idea called pixel farming that should, in the end, kind of crack the code of maximum yields, while at the same time maximizing biodiversity, because different crops, soil, and insects together benefit from each other. And so the aimed result is a kind of perfected nature, including insects and animals, but keeping people at a proper distance. That's it.
Thank you, Samir. So I'm going to try and do this in my least dentist-y voice. Johanna, Joe, do you want to come up? The doctor will see you now. I don't know how to do it in a way that doesn't sound like a dentist. Yeah, hi Joe, come up. So Joe is a founding partner of landscape architectural practice J&L Gibbons, Royal Design of Industry, Fellow of the Landscape Institute, and is a core research partner of cross-disciplinary projects led by King's College London. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you very much. Thanks, Eliot, for inviting me and this really fascinating evening. And I'm a landscape architect. Late at night, I walk the dog through the streets of London, and often a fox crosses our path, and with no fear, he stops. Our gazes lock, and at that moment of encounter, everything is held and level, somewhere between three sentient forms of life, wild, domesticated, and civilized. And I just wonder which one I am. When I was a child, an eccentric aunt used to say to me, "Joe, we're all animals." She gave me a book called My Family and Other Animals, and so began a journey that molded my outlook around my professional life. Our studio practice is underpinned by the philosophy of preeminent landscape architect Ian McHugh, rooted in an ecocentric sensibility that accepted the interwoven worlds of human and the natural, and sought to fully and intelligently design human environments in tune with the natural conditions. His seminal work, Design with Nature, presented the opportunities that ecological design could open up. A vision, as Lewis Mumford said, of organic exuberance and human delight. Today, Design with Nature, which was written in 1969, should be read not as a planning methodology, but as a design imperative. Humanity has affected the planet on a geological scale. Biodiversity is hemorrhaging, and the urban habitat expands more rapidly than any other. In this man-made scenario, why on earth do we not proactively focus on making it full of life, when intuitively we understand the benefits of nature? However, there's scant research that scientifically proves these benefits in terms of mental well-being. And over the last 10 years, led by King's College London, we've been research partners with artists' nomad projects, developing Urban Mind, an app that measures the experience of urban living in the moment and the impact of mental health in real time and in the real environment. In two recently published papers, environments with a diversity of life form were associated with greater and longer-lasting mental well-being, especially for those vulnerable to depression. Another looked at the specifics of birdsong. A multi-sensory experience that enriches everyday life, whatever our mood or whereabouts. Who hasn't tuned in to the melodic complexities of the dawn chorus early on a spring morning? Both papers provide an evidence base for creating and supporting biodiverse spaces. In the context of today's mental health crisis, urban nature has never been more important. But it goes without saying that wildlife cannot exist without habitat. Neither can humanity. The habitat mosaics of the city are a critical aspect of the landscape signature that define our urban neighborhoods, that underpins our very own sense of identity and belonging. We and our economies are embedded within nature, not external to it. Tonight, I'd like to briefly speak about our project in Oslo in Ingermunch Pier, won in international competition, a project that inherently fitted our design with nature ethos. An amazing opportunity to collaborate with artist Tracy Emin on her landmark commission for Oslo, a female nude inspired by Munch with a powerful vulnerability, facing out to the fjord, holding hope in her hands. With Emin's vision for the mother in mind, our concept was to de-engineer the pier on which the 9-meter, 19-ton bronze was to be sited, and create a most delicate, soft, deep seedbed for her to sink her knees into. We envisaged a meadow emerging from the natural limestone of the Oslo fjord, contoured with graded soils, creating a coastal ecology to support invertebrates and bird life. The bronze would create niches of shelter where natural vegetation regeneration would take hold, creating variable patterns of wildflowers, grasses, sturdy, resilient scrub planting, and indigenous trees that would gradually be pruned by the prevailing wind. Facing into that wind and towards the sea, the mother would protect her territory behind and around her. In her wind shadow, she would slowly establish a deep ecology, ever-changing and unfolding over the seasons and the time, evolving as a rich and unique coastal meadow habitat. The landscape would challenge perceptions of natural beauty and embrace time in a dynamic cycle with a light touch, long-term management ethos of creative conservation. It would be alive above and below ground. As part of the engagement process, through a collaboration between our social enterprise, Landscape Learn, and the Oslo Commune, we convened a meeting in a meadow, curated to discuss cross-sector opportunities and broaden the ecology of the project, to ensure synergy with the existing initiatives around Oslo, then the European Green Capital. Using our conversation in a meadow as an inspiration, a research proposal emerged to focus on urban bee pollination, entitled Hi Mother Bee, which established an exciting collaboration between the municipality, the design team, the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, and the University of Life Sciences in Oslo, taking a wider landscape scale approach to address questions of how the flower meadow, as part of the Mother art installation, contributed to the health, establishment, and restoration of bee-plant interactions in a location then classified as an ecological desert. In the first year, Hi Mother Bee evidenced surprising results despite the limited size of the meadow and exposed conditions, showing how quickly even rare and threatened bee species had found the meadow. In May, this coming May, findings will be shared through guided tours of the meadow on World Bee Day. In the meantime, the news from the research team is reassuring that despite the pair being isolated with water on all sides, the mother's meadow provides an abundant resource, particularly late flowering plants with high nectar production and blue-violet or yellow flowers. These foraging and nesting resources are otherwise rare in the city. A traditional meadow management regime to maintain its biological value provides a mirror on the past. Each September, the meadow is sized as a community event in celebration of the intersection of art, science, and humanities. The project has captured the imagination of the community, bringing many people together to celebrate natural beauty in all its forms, curating activities and events that invest in sharing knowledge and delight. The mother cradles a place to breathe, welcoming all of nature, organic, green, and gentle, conveying our deepest emotions, fears, and hopes. The requirement for biodiversity net gain and commitment to growing a nature recovery network in England are vital to reverse biodiversity loss. But the challenge of generating public awareness and fostering individual responsibility is even more profound, as it cannot happen unless we fire up a deep affection for nature and recognize that all interconnections that coexistence implies this deep entanglement of life, and this is in our hands.
Well, thanks, Joe. Our next speaker is Patrick Keiller. Patrick's a filmmaker who some of you or many of you will be familiar with. His work includes London from 1994, Robinson in Space from 1997, and Robinson in Ruins from 2010, which was the basis for the Robinson Institute, an exhibition held at Tate Britain in 2012. You can come, Patrick. Patrick.
Thank you very much, Eliot, and thank you for inviting me. This is a compilation of images of bat flight in an inner suburb of Oxford. How do I start it?
You want to hit...
Oh, there we are.
Yeah. Keep going.
Yeah.
There you go.
There we are. In April 2016, as a co-contributor to a People's Trust for Endangered Species survey, I began to look out for bats above our garden. In April 2018, I began noting the time and duration of regular visits by what was usually just one bat. Unless it was raining, too windy, or the temperature was below 9 degrees, it would arrive around 15 minutes after sunset, staying for up to 20 minutes. It was easiest to see the bat against the sky to the south, where the view is least obstructed. In May 2020, I began attempting to record its flight. To begin with, the recordings didn't show very much, as the bat was mostly outside the frame. But there were moments of what I had hoped to capture. There we are. Even at half speed, the maneuver was very brief. I had the idea to demonstrate the bat's flight in a single image by combining successive frames. Here are some more examples. The bat is a pipistrelle, seemingly a soprano pipistrelle. Individuals weigh between 3 and 7 grams. They eat as many as 3,000 midges, mosquitoes, and other small flies every night. They emerge from their roosts not long after sunset. This is when our bat usually appears, so perhaps it roosts nearby. Bats are relatively long-lived for mammals of their size. Pipistrelles typically live for 4 to 5 years, though the longest lifespan of a pipistrelle recording in Europe so far is 16 years. Perhaps we see the same bat every evening, or even every year, though I have no way of knowing that. Sometimes a second bat arrives, in which case the first one appears to chase it away, one of them returning after a minute or two. Later in the year, however, 2 bats often fly together for some time. When the bat leaves, rather than working its way along the street, it flies off to another location, perhaps to the nearby river. Here are animated versions of some of the last few images. In 2021, we more often saw the bat above the garden to the north. The wall on this side is lower, so that one can see what's happening further away. The bat emerges from hibernation in mid-March. The visits were longer than those recorded the year before, and many of the maneuvers more extensive. We see some animals and birds in the garden less often than we used to, but bats seem to be maintaining a presence in the neighborhood. I could say more, but it would be mostly speculation. The top one is a moth, I think. It's not a bat anyway. Those are blackbirds. Another moth. Two bats. That's it.
Thanks so much, Patrick. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So our next speakers, this is speculative because the last we heard, one of them was stuck on a train outside London, victim to this country's bad rail networks. Yeah. He's not here. Okay. So I'm welcoming just Nadeem Perera. Woo! Nadeem, I'm going to let you introduce yourself because I know that's part
You
of
did such a swell job. What's happening? How is everybody? Good. I am the #1 architect in the country. No, I'm not. Hands up if you are an architect or interested in architecture, though. That's good. Great. Get ready to be offended. No, I'm joking. I'm not the #1 architect. I'm not an architect at all, but I'm very appreciative of Eliot and everybody for having me here and speaking on this panel. I am a birdman. Definitely the best birdman in the UK. That is a fact. And I think it's really exciting to be able to speak and explore how architecture, particularly in urban spaces, can benefit birds, because that's kind of my thing. So a quick introduction on me, that's done. Flock Together is an idea that formed just over 4 years ago. It was concepted to combat the underrepresentation of Black and brown people in the outdoor space. And on our first walk, 15 people. On our most recent walks, over 300 people. So we've definitely succeeded in that area. But we're now on what we call phase 2 of our journey. And that looks like bringing creativity and creative solutions to ecological problems. Because Flock Together, while shifting the focus of our community to nature, it actually leaves us more open for new solutions, basically. That's our logo. flocktogether.world on Instagram. Follow it. So the first thing I'll get into is your design inclusive? So this is not me getting on architects, so don't get onto me. All I'm doing is exploring and checking the temperature, okay? So I know that populations are always increasing. We all know that. Populations, especially in urban spaces, are always increasing. So buildings are going to have to be made, can't avoid it. Fine, we can accept that. And to be honest, from the little bit of research that I've done, I can see that architecture is getting better at considering nature, specifically birds. I could go into how many birds buildings kill every year on their migration, but I want you to sleep well tonight, so I won't, okay? I won't. But it's a lot. It's a lot. Whatever you're thinking, it's more than that. But that's fine, because architecture as an industry is beginning to consider that. So we have things like vinyls on window panes, like big glass skyscrapers. They put these vinyls on them because birds fly in to these glass panes. They can't tell. They don't have as sharp eyes as us. And lots of them die that way. So these vinyls kind of break up the glass pane, and it lets the birds see it and avoids collisions. That's what I believed until I did the little bit of research, and I found out that these vinyls are actually not being installed properly by people. So they are not effective at all, and there are almost as many collisions as when the vinyls were, as before the vinyls were being put into use. So what we need to be considerate of here is how can we make sure our design is being inclusive and is considering all of the species that are well, most heavily affected. So how do designs fail today? Who's got a bird feeder in their garden? Hands up. Yeah, nice, good. Some bird enthusiasts. Hands up if you see blue tits in your, yeah, good. Robins, yeah, good, okay. Now that's really, really good, and it's very easy for us though, to look at outside our window, or look at our building, or look at our space and how we've designed it, and these bird boxes we've put up, and we're doing such a good job. We put trees in there, and we've got these birds. But there are key points that we've not highlighted and that are overlooked often when we're making these installations. So in a similar way that planting one type of tree is not going to benefit the wider ecosystem, the same way that encouraging one species of bird is going to push out many other species. And that effect is going to spill out into the wider ecosystem. So one thought that stood out to me, and I'll pose it as a question to you guys, is in the little bit of research I did, I saw that fundamental of architecture is considering how it fits into the skyline. And like a big part of that, at the forefront of that, is the respect for the city or the skyline or the view or whatever. Why is that respect not being granted to the animals? Right? Why is that respect not being granted to the wider ecosystem that we all share with? So it's not just these kinds of birds that need our help. And the interesting part is that the birds that are most affected are the specialist species, okay? These are the types of birds that are more sensitive to environmental change, more sensitive to a lot of things. And for this reason, they're harder to see and easy to overlook. So we need a place for specialists. So which species here are we talking about? We're talking about two birds I'm going to give you. Two birds I'm going to give you before my time is up. Number one is the swift. It's an amazing bird. Looks a little bit like a swallow, but is not a swallow. Makes a journey from sub-Saharan Africa, that's below Sahara, for those who haven't gone to uni, is below the Sahara and makes the journey all the way up here, specifically here. And it's done that for hundreds and thousands of years, possibly millions of years. And they are in fast decline. Fast decline. These guys spend 90% of their time airborne. So much so that their feet have kind of devolved into little nubs. So that means when they do land, it's really important that they have a place to live. And since the mid-1900s in this country, their population has declined by over 50%. And this is intrinsically linked to the discontinued use of eaves under houses. So that's an architecture thing, right? Right? Another species I'll give you is sand martin. Who's from East London here? Just say East. Right? Canal, Regent's Canal. If you go along Regent's Canal, you're going to see loads of these birds flying around, swooping around. These are called sand martins. Again, rely on banks. Banks that are easy to excavate with their claws, with their feet, and with their beaks. Again, sensitive to change, come all the way from sub-Saharan Africa. So for the last 30 seconds, I'm going to talk about creative ecotecture. I came up with that myself. Okay? But this is basically, all this is a chance to involve creatives in the process of architecture. So this space here, this building here, could easily have bird boxes on it. And we'd have blue tits, and we'd have nice Instagram pictures for our grandma. Great. But what these have here is specialist swift bricks that are helping these swifts survive. And these swift bricks do not have to be boring. They can be super creative and involve native urban creatives that can be involved in the architectural process, which is a benefit for wildlife, for creatives, and for architects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadeem. So our next speaker is, yeah, you can keep going. Our next speaker is Takeshi Hayatsu. He's a founding director of Hayatsu Architects and a senior lecturer at Kingston University. Welcome.
Wow, okay. I'm not expert, but I'm gonna talk about nature a bit. Nature is always important for our practice, And I'd like to talk about nature's relationship to architecture, not only the ecological point of view, but also the spiritual point of view. The naturalist R. Fitter's book, London's Natural History, was published in 1945, documenting London during the interwar period. What's remarkable about Fitter's work is that he observed the nature in the city with the unbiased eye, documenting and recording the species that coexist with the human-built environment. And seeing the urban landscape as part of the backdrop for ecology and observing how flora and fauna to colonize within it. Wildlife finds and adapts their habitats according to the situation. Here, peregrine falcons have their nest on top of Kingston College building in the Kingston's town center since 2003. The college set up a webcam and monitoring their nest ever since. They like the location because it reminds them the cliff environment where they were originally from. The building creates certain conditions which are suitable for certain species, and humans encourage them to colonize as they see it beneficial, but both functionally and spiritually. Sparrows nest on little wooden shelves under the deep projecting eaves, protected from predators. Humans see them as lucky birds because they bring feeling of harmony and happiness to their household. Their symbolism could appear on a small detail also. It is a gutter support bracket in the form of bird at end of the overhanging eaves. A very sweet observation of the mink house by Japanese researcher Kon Wajiro in 1920s. I'd like to talk a bit about my childhood memory. My family had a summer house near Mount Fuji in Japan. It was a very simple wooden hut in the forest, and we used to spend our time every year escaping from the summer heat. Living in the house meant living with bugs and animals. The house does not exist anymore, and this sketch was made from my memory. The house was elevated off the ground to avoid contacting moisture, creating a space underneath for various creatures to inhabit. It had a thin roof and permeable walls with sliding screens. I could feel the presence of animals and bugs even from inside, from the sound of squirrels running on the corrugated roofing sheet and crickets jumping on a soft tatami mat, and so on. In the house, there was a septic tank toilet, and it had a hole in the floor, very deep and dark. I always scared to go in there, especially in the nighttime. I imagined there's a monster living in the hole. And this kind of fear deeply relates to Japanese religion, Shintoism. It believes that there are 8 million gods in the world. There is even a god of toilet. It is a kind of spirit which people had close encounters during the nighttime. It is a mystical creature representing nature, living next to you side by side, hiding in the darkness, and appears only occasionally. Japanese animation film My Neighbor Totoro by Hayao Miyazaki in 1988 describes the story of two young sisters' close encounters with mythical creatures. The story begins with the sisters and their dad moving in an old house. It was called Obake-yashiki, meaning a haunted house. The creatures live in the dark spaces, such as the ceiling void in the roof. And this fan is put up and left in the ceiling by carpenters when they complete the topping out ceremony, which is a common practice in Japanese construction industry still today. The film beautifully captures the people's spirituality towards the nature embedded in their everyday life. Here, they are praying to the roadside statue, asking him to stop raining so that they can go home. It is about paying respect to nature. This is the tree where the mythical creatures live. The tree is raised with the sacred Shimenawa rope, a symbol often seen in Shinto shrines. In Japan, you can spot where the shrines are from distance. You look out for the area with dense, mature trees. The compound is protected by the torii gate, preserving oases for natural habitats. This small shrine is guarding the ginkgo tree from the pressure of urban development. And it is a useful way of protecting the nature, and the architecture plays an important role in this setting, making the spirituality of the place visible and guarding the environment. We try implementing this sort of thinking in practice in the UK context. And this is a pocket park project in New Malden for Kingston Council. We won the design competition organized by London Festival of Architecture last summer. It is a collaboration with the horticultural expert Hortus Collective and the local maker designer practice 1-to-1 collective. The project is about improving the existing green space and the roundabout. Our proposal is to enhance the place's biodiversity by creating a pond in the roundabout. The strategy is to excavate the existing roundabout, to form a series of berms on the green space to create a sound barrier, protecting and shielding the green space from the noisy road, and collect a body of water in the roundabout to attract invertebrates, insects, and birds. Because it is inaccessible by humans, it becomes a nature reserve in the middle of the roundabout for the wildlife to thrive. It is a historic route to New Malden town center with a drinking fountain forming the gateway. This original stone column had been replaced with a fiberglass replica, which currently stands in the middle of the roundabout. We propose to add another biodiversity column to form a symbolic gateway which stands in the water. And it can be submerged in tall reeds during the summer, but still visible from the distance. The form of the gateway is evolving now with the local community's input. This is one of the iterations showing the idea of recycled materials to form a bug hotel tower. The next step would be to work with the ecologist and biodiversity officer to design the structure for specific species. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Takeshi. Our next speaker is Gabriella Gómez-Mont, who is the head of Experimentalista, a transdisciplinary and creative studio that works with grassroots movements, progressive governments, and foundations across the world. She is also the former Chief Creative Officer of Mexico City, the founder of the Institute of Everything in Between, and visiting professor of practice at UCL in London.
Hola, Londres. I am incredibly happy to be here tonight. And before I start, a couple of things about me. The first one to know is that I'm not an architect, no, a daughter of any architect, but I have been fascinated by the means and the methods of architecture throughout my life. The second bit to know about me, and I think that every time one confesses a big stubborn love, it's a perfect X-ray to see the internal life and dynamics of somebody, and this is actually my big stubborn love, is Mexico City. So I was born and raised in Mexico City, though I've been living in London for the last 5 months, and I have a very strange penchant for gargantuan, inexplicable cities. And when I became Chief Creative Officer of Mexico City, that far was where my love led me into government itself after coming from the arts and culture world. I also realized that there was something truly interesting about policy and bureaucracy to make reality malleable. Something very troubled as well, but also fascinating to use as an instrument to think about cities and their futures. So nowadays, as Eliot mentioned, one of the projects that I lead is the Institute for Everything in Between, which is my wild child. Experimentalista is the one that does the serious work with vice presidents and mayors across the world. And some of the things that I'm really focused on right now is how do we actually take a deeply relational lens on the life that we're living right now, truly taking to heart this idea that nothing exists except in its relationships, and that we potentially need frameworks for our entangled lives that are not only in theory, but in practice and social rehearsal. I also feel that it is an incredibly interesting time to start troubling the boundaries, inhabiting the gaps, and re-articulating the separations, because as they say, the edge is alive. And as Filipa mentioned, I think one of the stories that we really need to undo nowadays is this history of modernity and the story of separation. So one of the things that I started focusing on in the past months that the Institute for Everything in Between came to life thanks to REARC, a fabulous new foundation that is allowing for very exploratory projects to take place the world over, is focusing on care and architectures for collective life. And when I mean architectures, I don't just mean the physical infrastructure, architecture qua architecture, but places architecture, languages architecture, imaginaries as architecture, and policy as architecture. And one of the things that I'm slowly starting, and this talk actually accelerated the process in a certain sense, is to think about the urban and more than human dimension of this care and architecture for collective life. So some of the provocations that I'd love to lead you in today, not necessarily with a specific answer, is how do we start thinking of cities in terms of their more than human relational infrastructures? How do we think about life-affirming infrastructures as well? Because in so many ways, cities have been that story of separation that I mentioned. Cities were the way that we walled ourselves up from nature, that we became better of it. But then again, things have a way of seeping in. So some of the things that I've been incredibly interested in these days is starting to think about the human and other human cities. And think about, specifically, given the Institute for Everything in Between, the liminal spaces, the tensions and the translations, the integrated, contested, invisibilized, and also bureaucratized nature of this. And in many ways, the policy has defined animals and cities in three broad categories. It's urban wildlife, it's domestic animals, it's livestock animals. And for everybody that thinks that livestock animals don't have a way of also becoming something else, because I think animals have a brilliant way of defining our categories as well as our policy. In the earthquake, in the 85 earthquake in Mexico City, that unfortunately felled a lot of buildings, something quite mysterious happened, that suddenly we had like these feral cows roaming Mexico City post-earthquake. And it turns out that it was because there was policy that did not allow people to have livestock, like big livestock like cows and goats in their backyards, but there was no policy about rooftops. So people would take up the cows as calves, and then unbeknownst to anybody, there was like a whole farmland living upon the rooftops of Mexico City. So basically, yes, animals have a way of defying all our categories, troubling all our boundaries, and I think even zoos are one of them, because in many ways, we have to think, when we think about cities, we need to think about zoos, just because these are the numbers, and most of the 10,000 cities that exist the world over are actually contained within cities, but also because animals have a way of escaping the boundaries. And actually, you'd be surprised to know how many animals escape every year, including in the UK, where there's been everything from a red panda that escaped this year. So in a certain sense, we've put bureaucracy to the task. I'm going to talk about a few examples only of places where I've worked and lived, because it's a really rich, really wild space. But for example, Amsterdam. When I lived there during the beginning of the pandemic, not too far from where this photo was taken, actually. And one of the things that I realized, because there was nothing much to do those days but just like gaze out at the river, was that even the young swans had bracelets on their ankle, and it turns out that Amsterdam actually has a permanent department that takes care of the ducks and the swans of Amsterdam, and they have their demographics, they take care of their health, et cetera, so they're not as wild creatures as they seem. In Mexico City, because so many people were abandoning dogs for some reason in the subway, and also because even dogs that weren't necessarily abandoned, but that had always been street dogs, liked finding their friends in the subway stations of Mexico City. A special department had to be created, and now it's actually a canine department that's the logo of the subway that has its own little form for the department that takes care of dogs that are found in the subway of Mexico City. And of course, less cute, but so interesting, this is the new rat czar for New York that was just appointed, and there is millions of dollars that are being put in to deal with the rats that are taking over New York. Then going to my region, because we do surreal very well, Pablo Escobar, who I'm sure you all know, unfortunately, one of the pensions that he had was his private zoos. But when he was put into jail, suddenly the hippos that he had actually ran amok very near the city of Medellin. And to this date, Colombia has a huge hippo problem and has had to have specialized group within the government that actually deal with the hippos, because hippos, as you probably know, are some of the most dangerous animals out there. Policy and urban planning. These are much more dainty little creatures than hippos, but Amsterdam, going back to Amsterdam, as you probably know, because this is very well known, there's been these lovely little interventions to make highways for butterflies and bees, et cetera, et cetera. You also have, because Amsterdam is, the Netherlands is actually one of the densest, the densest country in the whole of Europe. So basically, they've also started interesting policy around corridors for wildlife, as you probably know. And then you have cities in the US that, for example, the waste company in South Lake Tahoe actually has loans for people, as you can see, to bear-proof their garbage bin. So a whole series of policy as well. But then again, since animals love escaping our definitions, one of the things that has also been happening in terms of emergent and emergency policy, which is policy for disturbances, is that we're continuously now needing to contend with wildlife that we weren't necessarily used to in cities coming in. This is for two reasons. One of them is because we have encroached on their territory, as well as that we have been putting habitats at risk and also eating ourselves the food that was actually meant for all of the animals on the planet, including ourselves. And so, but also for a good reason, because some wildlife populations, because of protection policy, have actually been growing in numbers. So Detroit is an example. There are now coyote warnings, and they have an unforeseen number of coyotes. There's an estimate of about 5,000 of them roaming in Chicago or very close to Chicago and continuously coming in. You also have, in the pandemic, but now also before, this is Santiago de Chile, which is a proper city in Chile that has been seeing pumas in the streets, something that had been unheard of. And of course, there's also, because there's not only like city policy, but international urban policy. And there's been interesting things happening there as well. One of them is that because, as I mentioned, some of the numbers of certain species have gone up, fortunately, but also because they're migrating, let's say, the wolves from Germany to the Netherlands, both cities and non-city places across the world have been thinking about policy implementation. And basically, for example, the Netherlands and other countries have a thing where if any type of protected wildlife damages your property or eats your stock, if you have the right protection measures, they will actually reimburse you for the costs so that you have no incentives to actually kill the wildlife. And of course, in terms of other international policy, as you can see, Colombia proposes sending some hippos to India and Mexico, which I don't know what my government will think about, but hey, you never know, that is quite a gift, if you will, from one country to another. And then also, in a less funny, darker edge, animals also see the consequences of war along with us. So there's even international policy from the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums that does everything from evacuation services to contingency plans, because what happens during war, when zoos get hit and cities get devastated, they lose the staff, animals can starve, many times animals are roaming the streets and choices have to be made. Does one kill the animals? Do they roam the streets? Do they go wild? Are they transported everywhere? So there's actually policy internationally that deals with this. And then again, beyond the big policy that covers the planet, there's also the simple daily life of cities that sometimes defy policy. So I don't know if you heard of Romeo some years ago in 2011, who, while the Shard was being built, was one of the inhabitants of one of the highest floors of the Shard. And so he was actually feeding off of the scraps of the workers, which I think is a beautifully symbiotic relationship, what can I say? But the policymakers didn't agree, so Romeo had to go back to the forest. And then, I don't know if you follow the news, but this was just this morning in London. So I was telling Eliot that he and the full moon probably invoked a little bit of, what can I say, tricksterism from London's animals as well, because they were running loose for about 45 minutes. And of course, again, Mexico City, we will up you in London. So we have had like bulls entering high schools, and we have had more than 600 pigs because of a crash roaming our main highway. And I won't even add more pictures because it would be like an endless thing of animals running amok in my city. There's also a really interesting policy, and I think this is a burgeoning field that could be very, very good to explore deeper, because it is a troubled area, but that it's also an area of possibility, is policy for the more than human entanglements. So one of the examples of law that has existed for a while is, for example, of service dogs that help out with people, but there's actually really interesting organizations that have piggybacked on existing policy here in the UK, where it's actually street dogs that are trained for the assistance dog that don't need like hyper-specialized training. Street dogs actually get trained and then handed over to people that might need them for different purposes. Then again, it's also so interesting because human animals also love finding loopholes within policy and law. And I don't know if you follow this, but Patricia Mark some years ago for The New Yorker wrote this hilarious essay that she had a psychologist write her a letter that she needed a therapy animal. So she took llamas into the subway and into grocery places. She took pigs on planes, parrots to the cinema, and nobody knew what to do with this because she had a letter, so she mostly got away with everything. And I don't know where her and the pig went, but I have a feeling that that's London. It kind of like looks like 5 o'clock tea. But anyway, like in a less humorous bit, it's actually really interesting to see that symbiosis that happens between animals and non-human animals and human animals. This is actually a project in Los Angeles that has been rescuing all sorts of birds, but especially parrots, that form very strong attachments to their flock. And when the humans become their flock, that happens as well. So abandoned parrots, parrots whose owners have died and nobody inherits, are suddenly going through a huge amount of PTSD, as are war veterans for obvious reasons. So they have actually combined both, and nowadays there's a brilliant space where both veterans with PTSD as well as parrots actually bond in very intimate, very deep ways, and I highly recommend for people interested in reading that essay. But so how do we go actually from policy and bureaucracy, as much as I can make trouble odes to both of them nowadays after my government life and as a recovering citizen, but how do we go from rights to relationships? How do we think about that quality that nobody can explain and nobody can make legal frameworks for? And I think Mexico City, weird as it sounds, this is actually what Mexico City looked like 600 years ago before the Spaniards arrived. We were very much an amphibian city. You wouldn't think about it this now, but actually, believe it or not, the remnants of that city still exists. Mexico City is 60% green space. This is Xochimilco. This is the same place of the space that you saw. And believe it or not, 40% of the migratory birds, we need some flocking there as well, actually pass through Mexico City from the north on their way to the south. So besides that species there and all of the policy that has to exist to make these safe landing spaces for the species, migratory species, we also have, I think, what is possibly the world's most magical animal, which are ajolotes. Mexico City is the only place they exist in the wild. I won't have time to explain why. But just so you know, these magical creatures that exist in the same rivers that I just saw, A, are in danger of extinction in the wild, but B, they really are just like these fascinating things where you can cut off an arm, you can cut off half a heart, take out one eye, and it will grow back because it's a living stem cell. But so basically, since they're endangered, people like Luis Zambrano have been working very closely with the Chinamperos, with the people that still practice agriculture in the same way that they did 600 years ago, and basically created a symbiotic relationship between them. And so the better that the axolotls are, the better that everybody is, because we have been dealing with all sorts of ecological complexity to make this a good habitat for them. And so I'd say that in many ways, having more than human cities is actually a civilizational litmus test of where we need to go as a species, and that cities could actually point to two things. One of them is, how do we start on untangling what next generation rights looks like? That I'll speak a little bit more about that when we get to the panel. But second bit, how do we shift our imaginaries? Because again, like if these have been the spaces that protected us from nature, this is the most entrenched imagination that humankind has in terms of that separation between nature and humans. how do we actually intervene in the symbolic space to be able to shift our imaginaries into a place which will be in much more benefit to all of us. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Come and join. Yeah. So now Gabriella and everyone else who's been up here is going to come and sit on these comfy chairs. You're so far away. Everyone's coming up. Yeah, you're leaving room. And we're going to have a bit of a panel chit-chat and then open up to some questions. Hey, grab some water. There's not quite as many microphones as human beings, so we'll just do a kind of passing around. Joe, are you like you were saying, you don't want us to all sit in a really flat line, which I think is a good point. So you can, yeah. Perfect. So thanks to you all. I really enjoyed it. And I think this is going to be a little bit of a challenge because there are probably more of you than I can ask individual questions to. So I'm going to have to sort of ask questions to multiples of you at the same time. And we'll see how far we get, because I also want to allow people in the audience to ask some questions. But I kind of felt that listening as we went through, there were these kind of different scales constantly coming in, whether that's this sort of very direct scale of one-to-one interaction, kind of Patrick sitting in his garden observing bats, to the scale of the built object, and kind of Roberta and Takeshi's projects, kind of constructing things and seeing how they got on with that, and the much bigger scale of cities and territory, and I'm going to include policy in the bigger scale thing here, even though it exists at different scales, but to me, when I hear it described, it's this kind of big map of rules and ideas and constructs. And I'm trying to figure out how to get my way into these different things. But maybe as we're on the scale of kind of policy from your talk, Gabriella, I felt maybe we could start there. And something that Jo brought up in her talk was biodiversity net gain, and kind of not to kind of get it swamped down in this kind of technical thing. But I think it's interesting that recently this new legislation has come in that I don't want to butcher what it actually says. If you know a bit more than me, then please introduce it. But basically, early legislation that requires a certain amount of biodiversity, quantified biodiversity, to be included on new constructions in the country. And I want to use that as a starting point, and everyone can join in, but we'll start with Jo on why is that maybe good, why is that maybe weird, what imaginative policies might we bring in to kind of adjust it?
Yeah, I ended with that. It's a very important move, but it's just the beginning. It should be absolutely the baseline, the most basic. But at least it causes people to think and have to consider, and I think that's a good thing in terms of planning. But it doesn't provide any clues or inspiration as to the quality of those spaces. So it is just purely to do with those titles I put up there, which was distinctiveness and connectivity and that kind of strategic element, things that are easy to measure. So I think it is a really important move. It's very, very late in the day, but at least it's come now. Just like, recognizing that all animals are sentient, So I think these are important stepping stones, and what most progressive local authorities are doing are saying 10% as the baseline is not enough, we're going for 20. And so then it becomes a kind of like a vying thing. No, I'm going to have 30. No, you have 20. And, in a sense, you can get wrapped up in, again, percentages, but at least it puts it on the map, and it means that people are targeting, and we've certainly been approached by developers who want to know how they can look good. How can they look good? What should they be doing that still maintains viability in their eyes and integrates nature in a way that they can score points and get prizes?
Yeah, I mean, Gabriella, maybe you want to talk a bit to this, or anyone really, that this idea of how legislation both pose as a possible positive thing, but also can basically just be gamified or co-opted or sort of basically subverted by, I guess, market forces, capital, whatever it is. But I'm interested in your ending point on more creative forms of policy, or bringing in expanded imaginations. Would you like my microphone? This one?
I think so, because yes. I think it's, as I mentioned, I have this incredibly weird penchant and love nowadays for policy. And simultaneously, I also felt in my own body and my own work the limits of it. And I do think that the biggest shifts that need to happen are actually in our imagination and our imaginaries, that this is actually not the cherry on the cake. Because I'll read you how they have been defining this. Biodiversity loss from development must first be avoided as much as possible, and then any impact should be appropriately mitigated on site. When on-site mitigation is impossible or poses a threat to project viability, developers can purchase biodiversity units to compensate off-site from providers such as the Environment Bank. So basically, I completely agree that this could give us fuel for the fire to keep on rethinking our spatial environment, our buildings, our streets, our cities, et cetera, and simultaneously, until we don't properly trouble this neoliberal idea of what cities are for and what societies are for, and that we're optimizing for efficiency and productivity, which again are important, but they shouldn't be the be-all and end-all. I feel that we will be entrenched in things that don't necessarily move as much as they should the conversation forward. And we've seen that with the green bonds, that actually instead of creating all sorts of benefits, as was thought very much under the same reasoning at one point in time, has actually created very perverse incentives to keep on commodifying nature. So what does actually mean that if we can think about policy, and you know, I'm working in Colombia right now with the Vice Presidency of Colombia, and I've also been doing some work with Bogota. And there's some interesting policy there that I think could be potentially also of a mesh of legal frameworks that could take us to a better place, of everything from biocultural rights to personhood that has been granted to nature. What does it mean to have nature at the table, for example, and to give it a voice in the way that many people are professing, not in cities though. So I find that there's a really interesting urban conversation. There's the ZOOPS that you mentioned that the New Institute has been working on in terms of more than human governance and a way of thinking about legal transboundary policy for all of this. And last but not least, something else that is dear to my heart, which is the national care system for Colombia that I'm an advisor for, but that will actually have for the first time care, more than human care, within legislation. So it's potentially a mesh of things, but also again, like working very deeply in terms of our imaginaries.
This really makes me think of, I mean, loads of things that came up in the talks, but not least, Roberta, you used this great phrase of, you know, your project is this kind of in this interesting, like, unfolding phase where it's real, it's happening, but you're encountering in real time how you have to shift how you actually bring in biodiversity measures. You use this nice phrase of non-human life being kind of unproductive residents, or something like, you know, you allow people to not have to produce in a city, to not have to be productive, and that's also okay. And it made me think also when Nadeem was speaking about how you flagged up measures that can be put in place to kind of either bring about non-human life on buildings or stop birds from flying into windows. Vinyls, you know, might not be installed properly, but there's also the question of, okay, you install like a bird box on the side of your building, but what are you asking of the birds? Are they contributing to biodiversity? Does that make them useful? It kind of brings up these bigger questions of what questions we're asking of structures. Take the mic. I want to hear from both of you on that, basically.
Sorry. I just want to say, yeah. So biodiversity, it lacks, in my view, and based on my experience of battling this beast of representation, whatever the hell it is, yeah, is the lack of diversity in the natural world is reflective of the lack of diversity in the human world, yeah? So I want to see a black national park, yeah? That's what I want to see. For me, I think that a land, when we talk about reimagining, it's in this country, I don't think I've ever heard in the history of any national park, nature reserve, anything like that being owned by anyone other than one demographic. And I think that is reflected in the state of nature now. So I think by adding diversity to the input of who can manage and control these spaces and have ownership, as it were, of nature, I think we'll see a massive increase in biodiversity by increasing the diversity of input into nature.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, Roberta, I'd love Roberta for you to say a little bit about some of these people you're bringing in to help consult on how this Mausbunker, this building, is being used and constructed in Berlin, kind of in real time.
So basically the idea is that we do not treat animals and non-human actors as something we will design, we will plan, you get this brownie point and then you move on, but basically to form or give an agency to humans who are specialists in this, because we as architects are not, and how can we over the time see what needs are there. Like for instance, I was listening and then I was thinking like there is so much glazing and it's just so many things that we do not think, and bringing a collective of people who would kind of behave or like act in the name and be a spokesperson almost to a non-human, that would help a lot the building. And this is not something that happens only in the phase of planning, but it's something that should be planned throughout the whole life of the building, which usually we know you plan, there will be a kindergarten and this and that, and then the capitalism kind of kicks in and suddenly there is a Mercedes shop that happened in one of our projects, and then the policies and legislation come handy when you can kind of form these things and kind of tie them down that these things do not happen. So kind of taking the tools that exist and are usually against us, that we kind of try to subvert them and use them in our help.
Thanks, because I think I'm going to try and be speedy so we can open up to some audience things, but they're just, these things keep coming back, which are like constructing things or building things or designing things which take non-human life into account in a kind of equitable or critical way is really tough, and you encounter many obstacles. And I think both Roberta and Takeshi, when I asked you to present, you're almost a little bit nervous. You're like, what are you expecting me to show like a final idealized project that is perfect in some way, when you're kind of working on speculative ideas or sort of working through problems? And yeah, I said like, no, you can come with things that are a bit complicated and messy, like that's okay. What I liked about your presentation, Takeshi, was somehow this idea of you co-opting or reusing existing infrastructure, or repurposing it or subverting it, which I think is a really interesting proposal. Before we go to the audience, I kind of wanted to open up a bit more to the observation side of our presenters, whether that's kind of Patrick looking at bats and sort of showing through extended periods of looking how you can kind of see things that you wouldn't normally be able to see, or Filipa, and how kind of sound and your sound projects in Venice allow us to kind of understand other forms of life. I kind of didn't want to exclude these things from an architectural discussion because I think they're really important. I think the idea of observation is super essential. There's the philosopher and political theorist James Bennett talks about enchantment, and that comes from sort of sustained observation, having the power to change the world around you. And I kind of just wanted to ask Patrick, Filipa, anyone, how extended periods of looking at non-human life within an urban context has maybe changed your world or other people's worlds around you?
Instead of answering that, I would just feed into something that you said before.
Yeah.
I actually think that a lot of architecture has been thinking about animals profoundly. If we think how architecture has planned slaughterhouses, farms, spaces for like refuges for dogs, for instance, there has been a lot of thought put into creating structures to control, manage, and regulate animal life, and to make it easier. No? For instance, the history of the evolution of slaughterhouses, it also reveals a history of a growing sensibility by not having straight corridors and curved corridors. You're preventing an animal from seeing another animal being killed, for instance. So maybe it's just a matter of reversing, and instead of only thinking about managing, what happens if we also have an architecture that is also incorporating thoughts, considerations about non-human life in ways that are not just about control and efficiency.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I think we also need to expand it into a territory where it's really, really interesting culturally for all of us. You know, our relationship with nature is really, really related to the way in which we've been brought up, the experiences that we've had, how confident we feel about what's going on. You know, so many people who have a problem with the boundaries, and it's acceptable in one way and it's not in another. And I think we need to kind of create a different sort of, there's a great opportunity here in terms of an aesthetic. I'm not just saying everything should be messy and there should be no architecture. I think that there's so much biodiversity, for instance, in the soil that we don't even know about. We have to make space for natural processes to re-enter our cities. We need to kind of peel back the 20th century or mess it up a bit and then see what arrives, because nature will do that. And then to go to your point about observing, just be better observers. Just go slow a bit. There's lots of expertise. We've got so many naturalists in the world, in our neighborhoods, who can monitor. If you take Spring Watch every year, or lots and lots of ways of just collecting data from citizens who can then feel that they're engaged in understanding behavior more fully. So I think there's the engagement, the management, the design, the depaving of our environment is a kind of a really interesting opportunity to allow natural processes to express themselves.
Can I add to that? I was going to say something about policy, that, you know, this London plan now talks about, you know, this urban green factors, that it's about surface. You know, you have to, there's a sort of the level of the surface that it's probably a lot about sort of a building itself, but also the, you know, the ground and how much you can open up to make more biodiversified. And
yeah, because of course it's all related, isn't it, to climate change. We have to make things that are more spongy, more receptive, and then like we were all saying, then you get a diversity. Then you get a diversity which can be reflected in the people using the place, in people managing it, and who are celebrated for those specific skills which are being constantly demoted, I think. Sort of that management, that caretaking. We need to reverse it. We need to not build new, but we need to unbuild, and we need to take care in a different way of our environment that accepts organisms more inherently.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the clock, and I think we should just quickly open up to some audience questions before we run out of time, because I think that would be nice. Just some housekeeping. I'm going to let the host find people with their hands up, but please wait until you have a microphone, because it's really hard to hear people in here. We've got one at the front here, and let's see who gets the microphone first. There's one guy down here, right at the front. Okay, you can start at the back.
Nice, thank you. Yeah, it's really cool how everyone's topics have overlapped, and like projects that have happened, and things that are still like an emerging thought. So I think what I want to ask about is about strategies of disruption and overtaking, or resourced overtaking. And so this is about the city of Oxford in the UK, where you've got a university that holds a significant weight in decision making, and asking like, what can we do about unlawful practice of property owners and developers that either like partition projects and break them up into smaller modules so that they can sidestep legislation and avoid environmental impact assessments, or they combine them into a strategy that then says that selling this is linked to this thing, and then, for example, at the moment there's a bridge being built for a technology park that interferes with wetlands and like significant bird and bat ecologies. But then, yeah, right now there's a case of they have bypassed the environmental impact assessment for a project that's fundamentally linked to further projects And then it seems like as citizens, you're only able to respond to that when everything's been passed. So how can we, as concerned citizens, get involved, pause it, and then build that alternative plan? Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. So it's like how, yeah, I'm gonna try and recycle that into. So it's like how as citizens can we do more to sort of actually force change in policy?
I'll say, just brother, come to flock together. Just come to flock together, because I agree with what you say. Like it's like that big railway or that bridge that you're talking about, and it's like people want to protest these things. I don't think the change is going to come like that. I think the change is going to come from a shift in culture, a shift in people's attitude, intrinsic values, and that comes from creative projects that engage people, that captivate people in ways that really resonate with them. I mean, obviously we all know the value of protests and stuff like that, but in the environmental sector, I think that cultural shift is the way to go, which is a great opportunity to be creative and make nature sexy, which is not at the moment, you know.
But they want, you know, there's social value is something that is kind of very much part of the planning process now, and that's got great opportunity for engagement with young people. We've just been doing that in Leighton, and it's very, very early involvement, and that can't just be cursory or just superficial. It needs to. I think there's much more genuine interest in that informing the way in which project briefs are created, and that will then roll out into really good work with those engagement kind of activities at the foundation of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to respond, but maybe a bit more in a kind of general remark. I feel that, you know, when we talk about animals or like non-human life, there's always this kind of weird discomfort, because we're talking about non-human life, and we're even thinking about designing for non-human life. And the reason I think for us, why we didn't, you know, like really, let's say, make it a kind of central theme in our previous research, was because I think we are still in this sense of that we have a certain position regarding animals, right? And while, you know, like we also encountered with for example, like an indigenous tribe in the US, where they said, you know, like there's a certain arrogance if you talk about like nature, while we talk about nature as much more as managing nature, while you talk about nature in a kind of much more exploitative way, and almost like a consumption form of way. And if we don't change that, we can talk until we see blue about designing, but that will stay the same.
And to the point of biocultural strategies, that's precisely, I think, a really interesting thing, where what happens when we start developing and imagining cross-species solidarities? So I feel everything that you were mentioning about these ecological rights, I mean, what a beautiful thing would it be of flock together, but also the right to roam. And the right to roam is for humans here in the UK as well. No? So I have the feeling that there's, when one thinks about life-affirming societies and opens up to cross-species solidarities, I think we will all be better off in many ways.
Thanks. With my apologies to the person at the front, we're going to have to wrap up because we've hit time. However, come and find us and ask us your question. Unless it's is it a very speedy one? Is it quick? Please. Okay. What's your speedy question? You were the first hand up. It's true.
Actually, I have 3 questions, but I will.
No.
I will just ask one then.
Yeah.
Which one is the most important? Okay. In terms of intentionality, do you think our work in the modern human context, can our intention be pure? Can our work building for other animals, not for our own ego, for our desire for knowledge, for novelty, or not even for the hope of changing climate change so that our future generations can live better, can it simply be because we care about the animals? Can it simply be because we love the animals? In a word, can our intentions ever be pure?
Thank you. And that was quick. Thank you. So this is like, yeah, can we go through purely care alone, or do we need to also do our hands need to be forced sometimes? Is there a sort of balance in between? Does anyone have an opinion on this?
I don't think at this stage people care enough. So you need to get them in somewhere else. So for example, you mentioned making buildings for non-human use, purely for non-human use. I think we can do that with like art, for example. So if you take those San Martins, if there's an installation that can provide like some long-lasting aesthetics, that can also provide a safe home for these birds when they come every year. No human's going to use that, but the human gets something back from it because it looks beautiful, it's pleasing to whatever architectural trend is trending at the time. I think that for now, we need to cross-pollinate and meet people where they're at and make nature accessible in that way, and eventually long-term hope for the pure nature love and acting purely with the thought for nature and not for our own ego.
Filipa?
I may just add something since I finished my presentation speaking about how art could possibly make us think about how we care and love other species, but we know very well that love and even care can have very dark and very violent sides. No? Otherwise, there wouldn't be passionate crimes and so on. So I believe that beyond affect, there's also a sense of responsibility and the sense of sharing something and being part of something. No? And about learning to be more humble and embracing the fact that we are one species amongst many, many others. We are constantly traversed and inhabited and also remote controlled by many organisms, bacteria that live within us. And we share the world with also many others. And I think that beyond these affects of love and care that can also be very negative, just this sense of coexistence and responsibility may be more emancipatory on the medium long run than actually just these profound, deep, intense affects.
Two quick ones, yeah. We'll go Roberta, then Joe. Thanks.
But I think that also another thing is that we don't have to depend necessarily on the goodwill of certain individuals. We need to kind of educate and understand that without non-human, there is no human. So it's not like I'm a good human and I want to save someone. It's like, it's kind of all of us together are in the same pot, and we can't without them, no matter whether you have compassion or you don't. And humans need to understand this.
Joe?
Yeah, I just think experience, being being in it, having the opportunity to be in contact and learning is the most important thing we can do. It's not something we can do remotely. We need to be immersed in it, and there are so many opportunities which should be opening up now for that kind of interaction, because I don't believe unless you care or understand some fundamentals about our natural world, that you can then make it relevant to you. And I think that's something that can be shared, and it can be a very beautiful thing to do that together. You learn off each other, and it might be difficult in some ways, but I think there is a massive opportunity through education right now. Ecology should be one of the most fundamental, citizenship and ecology we should have as a foundation.
We have two educators trying to reach for the mic, but Takeshi, quick, yeah.
Yes, I think being a naturalist is really helpful to understand the nature, I mean, obviously. So yeah, I recommend going fishing.
Yeah?
Can I recommend one other thing? Is put your hand in the soil.
Great. Did you have a closing thing to say? Okay. I think this is such a great slide to end on. I'm so happy that stopped there. Thank you. So yeah, gracias. And thank you to Ellis Woodman and the Architecture Foundation for making this possible. Thank you to Amy, Matthew, Matteo, Rosa, and John for all the support and guidance in putting this together. Thank you to all the speakers, and thank you everyone here for coming.